In the winter of 1692, two young girls began to scream, convulse, and speak of invisible tormentors. Their village doctor could find no cause. Within weeks, neighbours whispered one word: witchcraft. By spring, hundreds were accused, and gallows rose at the edge of town. What happened to turn a quiet Puritan settlement into a place where ordinary people saw the devil in every shadow? Tonight, we'll trace how fear began in one small house and spread like fire through a community convinced the devil had come calling. Hey guys, hope you're all doing well. If you enjoy these videos, be sure to leave a like, comment where you're tuning in from, and what your dream is in life. It really does help. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and enjoy this stroll through history. You're standing inside a small wooden house in Salem Village, early 1692. The wind outside cuts through the cracks, and every sound carries through the floorboards. A fire burns low, and two children twist on the floor, crying out as if their bodies have turned against them. They're not ordinary tantrums or fevers. They shriek, crawl under furniture, and shout things that make no sense. One is 9-year-old Betty Parris, the daughter of Reverend Samuel Parris, and the other is her 11-year-old cousin, Abigail Williams. The family watches, whispering prayers, trying everything they know to calm them, but nothing works. And as days pass, the sounds in the parsonage turn from fear to something closer to dread. At first, the villagers think the girls must be sick. Maybe it's nerves, maybe hunger or bad air. Reverend Parris calls in a physician, one of the few available in the area. The doctor examines them, listens to their gasps and cries, feels their pulse, and finds no physical cause at all. That's when the explanation left the realm of body and entered the realm of spirit. In Puritan Salem, when medicine failed, only one other suspect remained. They said something unseen had taken hold, something sent by the devil himself. Suddenly the fits weren't just fits, they were evidence. You have to remember how fragile life already was in that world. Salem Village sat cold and isolated, with its meeting house at the centre, its pastures thin from the rocky soil, and its residents tired from endless disputes with nearby Salem town. People depended on their neighbours for survival, but they also distrusted them deeply. Add a winter of war rumours, crop failures, and fear of attack from the frontier, and the idea that Satan might be closer than anyone thought didn't sound entirely far-fetched. To these people, the devil wasn't a metaphor. He was the explanation that fit everything: illness, failure, sorrow. Even children could become his battlefield. Betty's father prayed night after night beside her bed, his voice hoarse and trembling. He urged her to resist, to seek God's help. But nothing eased the spasms. Abigail echoed her cousin, convulsing, screaming at invisible shapes. Their neighbours, hearing the noise through the cold night, started muttering questions. Why these girls? Why the minister's home? And if the devil dared start his work there, where might he go next? Fear began to thicken between the houses like fog, and by February the whispers spilled into every conversation in Salem Village. In homes lit only by tallow candles, families gathered and spoke softly about bewitchment. Old stories from England, carried across the ocean a generation earlier, gained new life. Witches, they said, could torment children without leaving a mark. They used a spirit familiar or signed a dark book. Puritan theology turned illness into moral evidence. When a child writhed on the floor, it wasn't a random tragedy. It was a sign. So prayers turned sharper. Every shadow could be a threat. and every sleepless night Salem moved one step closer to believing the unbelievable. As Reverend Parris's reputation wavered under the strain of his child's condition, pressure built inside that cramped wooden house. People came and went, offering theories, herbs, and prayers. Some said the girls had been cursed by the hand of an envious neighbour. Others warned that Satan targeted ministers first, to overthrow the church from inside its own walls. On some nights the girls would cry that they saw shapes, warning that the spirits wanted them to sign a black book. No one could prove it, but that didn't stop belief from growing. Outside, winter dragged on without mercy. Bread rose badly in the hearths, animals sickened, and people began connecting every misfortune to whatever haunted the Parris home. If your ox fell ill, maybe the same darkness touched it. If your child developed a fever, maybe the same hand pinched her in her sleep. The doctor's words, "no earthly cause," echoed louder with every retelling. The villagers didn't just fear for the minister's daughter anymore, they feared for themselves. One night, under gentle questioning, the girls whispered names. 3 women, all familiar, all living near the edge of respectability. One was Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean who lived in the Parris house and already existed on the fringes of their world. Another was Sarah Good, a beggar who muttered to herself in the lanes. The third, Sarah Osborne, had scandalized the village by skipping church and challenging property customs. Each woman carried the kind of reputation that made her convenient to blame. When the girls named them, the whispers solidified into action. The minister and his allies treated it as divine revelation. Think of how easily belief turns into certainty when everyone around you agrees. The townspeople, already primed to see spiritual warfare everywhere, now had names to attach their fear to. And once those names left the girls' mouths, they couldn't be taken back. Men rode out to fetch the accused women. Their arrival in custody was small theatre. Villagers watching, murmuring prayers, children hiding behind skirts. The first interrogations cracked the air in March, and Salem's quiet dread began to take form. Lawful men and ministers questioned the women in public halls. The afflicted girls trembled and cried as the accused stood in front of them, accused of deeds no one could see. Every cry seemed to prove guilt. Each fainting fit called for more questioning. By the end of that day, what had started as private suffering in one small house had become everyone's concern. It had turned personal faith into a public hunt for the devil among them. Inside the homes, the atmosphere shifted again. People bolted doors at night. The sound of creaking floors made hearts race. Servants hesitated to collect water from shared wells. Even prayer gatherings began to carry tension. Eyes darting to see who sat where, who looked too calm, too anxious, or too friendly with the wrong neighbour. Salem had entered a new phase where every good Christian was required to prove loyalty by fear, and fear spread faster than reason ever could. What no one could explain medically now had the weight of moral authority behind it. When Reverend Deodat Lawson came to observe, he added his own written account, listing the girls' contortions and cries, confirming what many wanted to believe, that something supernatural was indeed at work, that outside validation sealed it. Ordinary pain now had a cosmic explanation. The girls' suffering gave the devil form and presence. So within weeks, Salem's private worry evolved into public accusation. Neighbours who once shared bread now shared suspicions. They watched their children for signs, their cows for strange behaviour, their bread dough for cracks that might look too symbolic. The moment Betty and Abigail spoke those names, something irreversible began. The village no longer looked toward God for mercy but for vengeance. Ordinary ailments transformed into proof of invisible sin. and from that single spark, the torment of 2 children in the pastor's house, the fire began to spread. By the time the first confessions came, the community had lost the boundary between faith and fear. What started as protection of the innocent had turned into obsession, fed by the belief that the devil must be rooted out no matter where he hid or who he hid inside. When Tituba sat before her interrogators, the air in the room must have been tight enough to choke on. She'd been an enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's household for years, a foreign figure in the eyes of Salem's Puritans, her skin, speech, and customs marking her as different before she ever spoke a word. Once the girls had named her, suspicion didn't need much convincing. Everyone already knew where evil could hide. It hid in people who didn't quite belong. Under the weight of those stares, with ministers quoting scripture and magistrates demanding truth, Tituba began to speak. What she said next gave fear a language it hadn't yet found for itself. Her confession didn't begin as a dramatic performance. It began as survival. Interrogators pressed harder each time she denied witchcraft, and the more she resisted, the harsher they became. Eventually, perhaps realizing that denial meant the gallows, Tituba changed course. She said she'd signed the devil's book. She described a tall, dark man who had appeared and commanded her to serve him. She said she'd seen animal shapes, dogs, cats, birds, that did his bidding. For Puritan ears, this was all too familiar. These were details straight from the sermons that warned them of Satan's work in the mortal world. Every phrase she uttered fit the theology perfectly. Once she began telling them what they already feared, they leaned in closer. Her story grew until it sounded biblical in scale. She spoke of black dogs walking upright, of spirits that clawed at children, of flying through the air on command. She said Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne had joined her. She hinted that there were others unnamed, waiting to sign the devil's book as well. To the magistrates it wasn't fiction. It was confirmation. They'd been waiting for proof that the devil had embedded himself in their village, and now they had it, spoken by someone who, to them, would have had no reason to invent it. The fact that her testimony came through tears only made it seem more sincere. It's hard to overstate how naturally her confession fit into Puritan thinking. In a world where misfortune carried moral weight, witchcraft made perfect sense. If your cow died, if your field flooded, it wasn't random chance. It was a hand guided by Satan. Puritan theology had been warning of that for decades. Now here was Tituba, describing exactly how it worked. Her blend of local superstition, Puritan imagery, and what might have been fragments of her own storytelling painted a picture so vivid that even skeptics hesitated to question it. The invisible world suddenly had rules, structure, even organization. Good and evil weren't abstractions anymore. They were names written down in a literal book. The magistrates didn't treat her words as desperate invention. They recorded them as evidence, nodding along as she spoke. John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin questioned her, their pens scraping across paper as if documenting a war report. She wasn't just confessing. She was testifying against an army of darkness. That's how it was understood. The more elaborate her story became, the more power it gathered. Instead of seeing her confession as a plea to live, they saw it as revelation, a truth wrung from the human vessel of sin to expose the devil's ranks. In their minds, this was divine intervention through forced honesty. Salem had been hungry for a reason behind the chaos, and now it had one. The afflicted girls were no longer merely strange, they were proof of spiritual warfare. The 3 accused women were not misfits, they were soldiers of the enemy. And if there were 3, there could be 30. That logic spread fast. Overnight, Puritans began searching for signatures of the devil's work everywhere they looked. Household objects took on new meaning. Bible verses were debated at kitchen tables. People stopped questioning whether witchcraft was real and started wondering only who else might be involved. For Tituba, this confession may have been the only shield she had. In Salem's hierarchy, her voice was the weakest, her status lowest, her life the cheapest to spend. She likely understood that saying nothing meant her body would become proof anyway, laying limp at the end of a rope. So she gave them what they wanted, words alive with demons and darkness, hoping it might buy mercy. Instead, it gave Salem direction. The court treated every word as gospel because it reinforced their worldview. The interrogation notes began circulating, referenced by ministers and townspeople alike. Her narrative transformed from coerced speech to divine verification. The cultural boundaries around her turned that testimony into something more potent. Coming from a white Puritan woman, the same story might have been questioned, maybe even dismissed as hysteria. But coming from Tituba, whose difference carried the weight of exoticism and danger, it sounded authentic to them. They'd already cast her as otherworldly long before she opened her mouth. So when she described visions of black dogs, shadow figures, and a spectral book filled with signatures, they heard not imagination but confirmation that evil had entered through the most plausible vessel. She embodied their fears so perfectly that even her truthfulness stopped mattering. That's how authority and bias intertwined. The magistrates, educated men of their time, believed they were saving a community from Satan's corruption. They viewed their acceptance of her story not as gullibility, but as duty. They believed they were defending God's kingdom. In taking her words literally, they gave terror the credibility of law. And once the law spoke, fear no longer needed rumor to survive. Fear now had transcripts, witnesses, and warrants. The church's language of sin became the court's language of evidence. Everyone in Salem could now point to a signed confession and say, "There, that's the proof." From that moment, hysteria wasn't only emotional, it was institutional. Tituba's confession armed the courts with moral validation. Each new arrest followed the same rhythm. Accusation, confession under pressure, more names added to the devil's book, more proof for the judges. What began as whispers of witchcraft in one house now functioned like an organized investigation. Tituba had unintentionally drawn the map, and Salem would spend the rest of the year following it. Her story spread far beyond her intent. Villagers recounted her words at sermons and night gatherings, adding their own details each time. A flying creature became an omen seen near their barns. A shadow passing by a window became a new sign of pacts being made. Her confession slipped from record into folklore before the ink had dried. It was no longer just her story. It was Salem's master narrative, retold by everyone who needed to feel righteous, or justified, or afraid. For the men in charge, her story was the missing link between the afflicted girl's fits and the invisible evil tormenting them. It gave their authority purpose. Each magistrate could now see himself as God's weapon against Satan's army, not just a colonial bureaucrat hearing neighborhood quarrels. No one questioned whether the story felt too poetic, too convenient, or too rehearsed. The logic of fear never requires consistency. It only requires repetition. In that way, Tituba's confession did what fear alone couldn't. It turned suspicion into policy. The governor's men took interest. The ministers preached about vigilance. Ordinary villagers rehearsed the rhetoric of spiritual battle. With each retelling, The moral line between faith and fanaticism blurred further. Salem's war against witchcraft had gained official sanction, all from the words of a woman who'd been forced to speak to survive. And from that point forward, every accusation came with precedent, every arrest with justification. Fear had acquired paperwork, and the search for evil had only just begun. By early 1692, Salem Village already felt like a tightrope stretched between two sides, pretending not to notice the tension. Witchcraft wasn't the beginning of the trouble. It was the match that landed on ground that had been dry for years. One half of the community looked towards Salem town just a few miles downriver, where trade and commerce filled the streets with goods from England. The other half, mostly farmers in the village, saw that same wealth as sin disguised as success. They wanted separation from the town's influence, their own minister, their own taxes, their own way to worship without being reminded of profit and pride. The feud over who paid what, which church they attended, and who wielded the moral authority had been dividing the villagers long before Betty Paris ever screamed. You can almost feel the relief that came when they finally had something, someone, to blame for their problems. The Putnam family stood right at the heart of it. They were old settlers, proud landowners, and devoted supporters of Reverend Paris. Their worldview leaned hard on discipline and obedience. To them, the arrival of new, wealthier families who traded in Salem town looked like the start of moral decay. Thomas Putnam especially believed the community's suffering came from those who put greed before God. Every argument about land boundaries, every unpaid tax, and every skipped church service seemed to confirm it. So when whispers of witchcraft spread, the Putnams didn't hesitate. They treated it as a holy summons to restore order to a world slipping out of their moral grasp. The others, those who saw prosperity as God's reward, brushed off the fear and called it old-fashioned superstition. Both sides thought they were right. Both thought the devil was hiding on the other's property line. Behind this conflict were all the small routines that kept the village barely functioning. Neighbours borrowed farming tools and accused each other of never returning them. Cows wandered into the wrong pasture, fences were moved a few feet too far, and grain deliveries came up short. It sounds petty now, but the stakes were survival, and when survival became spiritualized, grudges turned righteous. The holy war between Salem Village and Salem Town didn't need formal lines. It played out in chores, markets, and Sunday seating. At church, the first pews became silent battlegrounds, signalling allegiance more clearly than sermons ever could. The Paris supporters sat together, stiff-backed and watchful. The others, often connected to wealthier town merchants or moderate neighbours, avoided eye contact but never missed the minister's glance. In that atmosphere, witchcraft fit perfectly. It was a social weapon made invisible and blessed by moral purpose. Calling someone a witch wasn't random. It often followed a land dispute, a family feud, or a debt unpaid. Each accusation served double duty, cleansing sin and settling scores. So when the afflicted girls began naming names, it wasn't lost on anyone that many of their targets were people who'd argued with the Putnams or resisted Reverend Paris's authority. Over time, that pattern became impossible to ignore. The families on one side filed complaints, and those on the other side found themselves arrested. The gallows list looked suspiciously like a village map of resentment. Thomas Putnam, who never met a conflict he couldn't formalize, filed complaint after complaint, 12 in his own hand, according to the records, and he testified against twice as many people. His daughter, Anne Putnam Jr., followed the lead of adults around her like a child learning the rhythm of defense and accusation. She accused 48 individuals in total, an extraordinary number for anyone, let alone a 12-year-old. She stood in court often, trembling, crying out, naming person after person. Whether guided, encouraged, or simply modelled by those around her, Anne became one of the most powerful voices of the entire crisis. Through her testimony, neighbours turned overnight from old friends into agents of the devil. The strategy was subtle enough that no one could call it strategy. It hid beneath the language of righteousness. The Putnams claimed to protect the community from the devil's infiltrators, yet each name they gave tended to belong to someone standing in their way. Land competitors, church dissenters, or those married into rival families. Witchcraft in their world became a final form of social correction. If they couldn't win through persuasion or prayer, they could win through accusation. Each confession extracted under fear seemed to prove them right. Each hanging silenced another rival. No one admitted it aloud, but everyone could see the pattern forming. Meanwhile, daily life tried to carry on under this slow-motion divide. The same villagers who accused their neighbours still had to share wells, pass on paths, and trade milk or candles. You'd see two women drawing water side by side, each avoiding the other's eyes, each thinking about whose name had surfaced last at the meeting house. Market transactions became charged events. When someone's bread failed to rise, when tools broke too quickly, or when a child fell ill, people began to suspect sabotage instead of chance. Even the shared pews on Sunday morning turned into quiet surveillance. Some parishioners sat rigid and silent. Others stared straight ahead, hoping no one saw doubt in their faces. Salem's piety became performance, an act of self-defense. Underneath the godly language, this was a fight over identity. Who really owned Salem Village? Those who toiled on rocky soil, or those with hands clean from trade? For years, both had coexisted under uneasy truce, but witchcraft allowed that argument to switch from economics to morality, from civil to spiritual war. A land dispute might ruin your crops. A spiritual accusation could erase your name altogether. When a man lost property in a border conflict, it stung. When his wife was accused of signing the devil's book, it destroyed him. Every argument reached a higher pitch because the stakes now included eternity. The web tightened across kinship lines. Marriages linked families that stood on opposite sides of the feud, turning dinner tables into political fronts. Even silence became suspicious. If you didn't praise the trials, you might be next. Children especially soaked up the tension, repeating overheard grudges wrapped in God's vocabulary. Anne Putnam Jr. became the tragic mouthpiece of all that confusion. Young enough to be believed, old enough to recite her father's anger word for word. Each time she collapsed or screamed in court, the adults nodded grimly, convinced they were watching divine judgment revealed through a child, and so the old boundaries of the feud hardened under supernatural light. Salem town's commerce-minded families viewed the trials with disbelief, while Salem Village's defenders of purity saw that disbelief itself as evidence of guilt. You either stood with the afflicted or with the suspected. There was no middle. With every execution, wealthier households withdrew further from the village, deepening resentment among those who stayed. Suspicion became structure. The courtroom replaced the meeting house as the place where consciences were tested, and the law began echoing the pulpit. When all the complaints and testimonies are laid side by side, you can trace the fault lines not through demonic possessions, but through property boundaries and unpaid debts. Salem's ghosts carried land surveys and grudges more often than broomsticks. The witch hunt became a family project, a civic purge disguised as spiritual duty. The accused rarely shared anything in common except their connections to the wrong side of the village. Where the minister's prayers had once tried to unite his followers, the court's record split them permanently. By spring, the line between faith and politics vanished entirely. Ministers blessed proceedings that targeted one faction's opponents. Neighbours who tolerated each other for years now used God's justice to settle unfinished business. None of it would have succeeded if the old disputes hadn't been sitting there, waiting to be sanctified. Salem didn't have to invent chaos, it merely baptized it. The hauntings that followed weren't only about devils tormenting bodies, they were about guilt, envy, entitlement and grievance, things far more durable than superstition. Spectres may have filled the girl's visions, but the real ghosts were landmarkers, grudges, and unpaid respect. And once those grudges entered the courtroom, they stopped being whispers and turned into verdicts. The trials didn't invent fear, they legalized it. What if someone could point at you, claim your ghost attacked them in their sleep, and that alone could hang you? That was the logic running through Salem's court in 1692. To handle the flood of accusations, Massachusetts officials created the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which literally meant to hear and determine. It sounded official, but what it really did was turn rumour into record. The judges, men like William Stoughton and Jonathan Corwin, sat in judgment beneath the cross, surrounded by ministers and spectators, willing to listen to evidence that couldn't be touched, heard, or seen by anyone but the accusers. You didn't need a mark or a witness. You needed someone to say your spirit hurt them, and suddenly that counted as proof. People called it spectral evidence, and it was as slippery as smoke, impossible to challenge and terrifyingly easy to believe. The trials took place inside public meeting houses, which weren't as grand as the word courtroom might suggest. They were cramped wooden halls where the air never quite lost the smell of sweat and tallow candles. Crowds packed the benches, murmuring prayers one moment, gasping the next. The accused stood before a panel already leaning toward guilt. When the afflicted girls were brought in, their convulsions were treated as divine instruments revealing truth. If they shrieked when the accused looked at them, that was seen as confirmation. If they suddenly stilled when a minister prayed, that proved witchcraft feared holy words. Every gesture became theatre with mortal stakes. The louder the reaction, the stronger the case. And once panic became performance, no one knew where faith ended and fear began. Inside this new machinery of justice, visions were stacked alongside physical evidence. Witnesses claimed to see shadows pinching them, birds perched on rafters carrying messages, or ghostly figures begging them to sign dark contracts. The judges asked detailed questions about colours, voices and smells, writing it all down as if it were testimony given under oath. There was something methodical about it. Salem wasn't descending into wild chaos so much as organising its madness. One by one, people learned how to present their nightmares in proper legal form. You could condemn a neighbour by recounting your dreams, and the more vivid your story, the more credible you seemed. Not everyone agreed this was justice. Some ministers urged caution, warning that the devil, being deceitful, could impersonate even the innocent. Cotton Mather, one of the most respected religious figures of the time, wrote to the judges advising them, "Do not lay more stress on pure spectral evidence than it will bear." He understood that superstition was a double-edged weapon. It could protect the community or cut it apart. But even in warning them, Mather still supported the broader mission. Witchcraft was real, he insisted, and the colony had to root it out. That half-hearted caution was enough to create an illusion of balance, but not enough to slow the trials. The judges satisfied their consciences by noting his concern and continued as before. Each trial followed a ritualistic rhythm. A minister opened with prayer, pleading for God to expose the guilty. The accused, usually trembling or exhausted from jail, stood front and centre. The afflicted began their fits, clutching their throats, contorting, crying that they saw spectral birds or devilish shadows hovering near the accused. The crowd leaned forward, eyes wide. The judges listened, occasionally interrupting with stern questions. Did the spectre look like this person? Did it threaten you? What mark did you see? And when someone answered yes, the gavel of belief fell heavier than any wooden mallet could. To doubt the afflicted would be to doubt divine revelation. No one wanted that sin on their record. The first real test came with Bridget Bishop. She was 40-something, outspoken, and ran a small tavern. She wore bright clothing which already marked her as suspect among the strict Puritans. She had a reputation for gossip, for being quick to argue, and even quicker to ignore the quiet codes of humility expected of women in Salem Village. None of that was illegal, but in that year it may as well have been. The afflicted claimed her spectre pinched them, pricked them with needles, and tempted them to renounce God. Several men swore that when she walked by, their oxen died, or their beer turned sour. The court of Oyer and Terminer listened to every word. A jury, steeped in fear and scripture, found her guilty. On June 10th, 1692, Bridget Bishop was hanged, the first official execution of the Salem Witch Trials. Once someone had died because of spectral evidence, any lingering hesitation within the court disappeared. The system validated itself. Each hanging proved to the spectators that witchcraft was real, because only witches could have caused such torment. Each new confession confirmed it further. The circle fed itself neatly, tightening with each name added to the list. Ministers preached about vigilance, saying the Lord's work demanded purity be restored. The gallows creaked outside town, and that sound was treated as justice fulfilled. But doubt whispered at the edges. A few clergymen worried aloud that the afflicted's visions seemed to mirror the sermons they'd recently heard. If the devil could mimic the innocent, who could trust a ghost's word? Still, their caution remained private, drowned by louder calls for holy cleansing. For many villagers, every execution was proof that God was watching and responding. The hangings were not seen as punishments, but as purifications, and for those in the crowd, watching a neighbour swing in the summer wind felt both horrifying and virtuous. The law and the pulpit had finally merged, feeding off the same fear. Spectral evidence became the lifeblood of that merger. An invisible crime created an endless supply of possible culprits. You couldn't disprove a dream. You couldn't break an invisible chain or show a jury the absence of the ghost. The accused who refused to confess only appeared more guilty. After all, even the devil himself would deny the charge. The accused who did confess found themselves forced to name others to save themselves, and so the web expanded endlessly. In this logic, truth had no fixed shape. It bent to belief. The human eye became a tool of divination, and the imagination became the highest court. The entire atmosphere of Salem's trials resembled a religious service more than a civic proceeding. Ministers opened and closed each session with psalms. Spectators wept openly. Every gasp, every shout from the afflicted was taken as new testimony from the invisible world bleeding through into the mortal one. The difference between witness and participant vanished. Some swore they saw spirits in the rafters above the accused. Others claimed they heard whispers near the gallows. The courtroom was no longer a place of reason. It was a stage where salvation and paranoia traded masks. By the time summer turned to fall, hundreds faced accusation. The judges believed themselves righteous shepherds guarding a cursed flock. Their robes carried both civic authority and divine purpose, but for all their rituals and prayers, the evidence guiding them still flickered like candlelight, unsteady, untouchable. Every cry of pain in the courtroom echoed through Salem streets by night. People who once locked their doors out of fear of witches now did so out of fear of the court. Spectral evidence gave them order. It allowed belief to bypass proof, conscience to bypass doubt. The trials became theatre not because people wanted spectacle, but because the structure of fear demanded it. Fear needs witnesses, and the court of Oya and Terminus applied them daily. A single vision could mean death, and each execution proved how far imagination could travel when given legal standing. By the time the leaves began to fall, Salem's sense of justice had become inseparable from hysteria. The courtrooms were full, the prisons overflowing, and the rope work worn smooth from use. What had started as faith defending purity now looked more like faith feeding itself. The more bodies swung, the more the village began to wonder who exactly they were saving. The rope tightened not only around the necks of the condemned, but around the colony's conscience, stretching thinner with every prayer offered in the name of God. You wake up to the sound of chickens outside, and for a second, it feels like any other morning in Salem. But then you hesitate before lighting the hearth. The woodpile looks smaller than yesterday, and you wonder if that means something. You pour water to make dough, but when the bread refuses to rise, your stomach knots. Maybe the yeast was old, or maybe someone wished you harm. Thoughts like that have become impossible to shake. This is daily life under suspicion, where superstition and survival share the same breath. The witch trials have taught everyone to read omens in everything. Every cough, every spoiled meal, every dead animal becomes part of a story too dangerous to question. You learn quickly that words can kill, and silence can keep you alive. Everyone goes to church because not going is too conspicuous. The meeting house used to be a place for prayer. Now it's where people count who sits beside whom, and who looks uneasy during the sermon. You keep your hands folded and eyes down, because drawing attention is the last thing you want. Gossip hums between hymns. Someone whispers that Goody Mason's butter spoiled overnight. Another says Goodman Thomas's ox fell in the marsh because he'd refused to pray over it. The minister preaches about vigilance, and you nod along with the rest, even as bile rises in your throat. Attendance isn't faith, it's insurance. If you sing too softly, people wonder why. If you sing too loud, they wonder who you're trying to convince. By now, Salem's streets feel hollow. People walk faster and talk less. Doors close quietly, latches slide into place, and smoke curls from chimneys that hide more fear than warmth. Once neighbours shared meals, traded gossip about harvests and road repairs. Now no one accepts food from another's kitchen. Even a simple act, offering a pie, can turn sinister. Why is she being so kind? Does she want me to owe her something? It's safer not to ask, not to speak, not to linger. The silence is thick enough to measure. Chores still have to be done, but even those carry weight. When a cow dies, it's not just bad luck, it's evidence. When a child falls ill, parents search for explanations that don't make sense but feel necessary. The weather changes, fields flood, bread spoils, all reminders that God might be testing them, or the devil might be near. Every home feels surrounded by invisible dangers. The minister's sermons no longer soothe. They reinforce what people already fear. That evil wears a familiar face, so you pray each night not to be noticed. That's how people survive now, not by courage, but by invisibility. Neighbours used to greet each other over fences, now they glance away. A smile can look rehearsed, a frown could mean accusation. The very rhythm of small-town life, the borrowing of tools, the sharing of news, has broken down. When someone's cart overturns, no one stops to help. Kindness has become a liability. At night, candles burn later than usual, not for reading but watching. You check the road often, half expecting the sheriff's horse to appear in the dark. The pounding on the door might come for anyone. Inside the homes of the accused, time moves differently. Families don't sleep. Bread goes uneaten. Children whisper questions parents can't answer. A husband might sell his livestock to hire a lawyer, but the neighbours see it as proof of guilt. After all, an innocent man would have faith in God's justice, wouldn't he? Those left behind wear their shame like a shroud. Visiting an imprisoned neighbour risks your own safety, so most won't do it. The village's morality twists itself until mercy looks suspicious. For those who risk speaking up, life became unbearable. A few villagers tried to defend the accused, saying the evidence was invisible, that only God could judge. They were rewarded with new rumours. Perhaps they were bewitched too, or worse, protecting fellow servants of the devil. So they stopped. One by one, voices fell quiet. The whole town learned that silence was smarter than honesty. If someone screamed during church, you prayed it wasn't at the sight of your spectre. And if the afflicted collapsed near your pew, you began planning how to prove your innocence before anyone even accused you. Even the imprisoned weren't entirely gone. Their absence haunted everything. Husbands tilled fields that used to be their wives' domain. Children grew mute from shame. The community claimed to fight for purity, yet corruption seemed to bloom everywhere unseen. When the gallows took one of your neighbours, you baked bread you couldn't eat. The smoke from the execution hill hung low, carried by the sea breeze through the town. It wasn't lost on anyone that you could smell judgment on the wind. By midsummer, the emotional exhaustion showed on everyone's face. Eyelids drooped, backs stooped. People screamed at shadows, then blamed witchcraft for their own nerves. The human body wasn't made for this kind of constant vigilance. Fields lay untended, trade slowed. Entire families fled or fell silent, pretending not to exist. Some who'd survived accusations carried guilt heavier than the condemned. Being spared didn't feel like grace, it felt like betrayal. They asked themselves why they were still free when better people swung at the edge of town. That sort of guilt grows quiet, but it doesn't go away. The hardest part wasn't the fear of being accused, it was the fear of believing. Every person caught between loyalty and doubt had to perform piety perfectly. You couldn't appear skeptical, yet believing too fiercely might also look false. Even your dreams became dangerous. Some villagers confessed to witchcraft purely out of exhaustion, hoping the gallows would end the guessing. Their deaths were supposed to prove righteousness had triumphed, but instead it left everyone too frightened to feel relief. Children learned faster than anyone. They memorized which names to stay away from, and which prayers to say the loudest. You'd hear them chanting verses in the lanes, small voices reciting lines of fear like nursery songs. Parents nodded approvingly, pretending not to notice the tremble in their voice. Faith became something to cling to, not because it brought comfort, but because it was the only script everyone still shared. Evenings in Salem grew longer than the daylight could justify. Doors barred early. Cooking smells faded as people began rationing food and trust in equal measure. Women stopped nursing the babies of accused mothers, worried it might pass a lingering curse. Wells went unattended because villagers feared whatever hand last touched the bucket. The town functioned on isolation, 100 tiny quarantines of conscience. The most dangerous sound was a knock at night. Few answered it anymore. Still, somewhere within that terror, life went on. People mended fences, baked bread, whispered prayers into sleeves. They stopped expecting safety and started counting survival one sunrise at a time. The silence between houses became its own uneasy peace. No one spoke of hope, only endurance. Salem's people learned a new kind of faith. The faith that if you said nothing, looked at no one, and prayed hard enough, maybe the devil would choose someone else. It wasn't much, but it was life. And as the hangings piled up, even the judges began to sense something shifting, an unease creeping back toward the very authority that had fed it. The colony's fear had reached its edge, and soon even the courts themselves would start to tremble. By the start of 1693, Salem had begun to tire of its own terror. The hangings, the fear, the constant pretending, somewhere between prayers and executions, the conviction that they were doing God's work started to blur. Even the most devout ministers found themselves asking the question no one dared speak aloud earlier. What if the devil wasn't in the accused at all? What if he was in the courtroom? You could feel the fatigue in the air. Jails overflowed, crops spoiled, and the same ministers who once thundered about divine justice now shifted uneasily in the pulpit. They still believed in witchcraft, but the evidence no longer convinced them. 9 months of accusations had bled the excitement from belief. You can almost picture those ministers, faces lined from sleepless nights, shuffling through depositions that all sounded the same. Visions, shadows, pinches, invisible wounds. The more they read, the more repetitive it became. The spectral evidence that once thrilled them now felt like gossip written in formal script. Magistrates who'd once leaned forward in righteous intensity began glancing down at their own notes, realizing none of it could stand on tangible ground. The judges had created a machine designed to produce guilt, but now it was starting to run without purpose. Some still insisted they were doing God's will. Others looked at the empty pews, the broken families, and wondered what kind of faith required so many graves. Then came the moment authority blinked. Governor William Phipps returned from the frontier to find his colony strangled by the trials. His own wife's name had surfaced in whispers, and that seemed to settle his patience. When the accusations touched the governor's household, reason suddenly resurfaced. He stepped in, halted further executions, and in October dissolved the court of Oyer and Termina entirely. Just like that, the central stage of hysteria disappeared, not with a speech, but with an order. He replaced it with a new court, one forbidden to accept spectral evidence at all. It was a quiet act that changed everything about how witchcraft could be proven. Without the devil's footprints in dreams and visions, accusers had nothing to stand on. The court had been feeding on ghosts. Now it was forced to live on facts, and facts were in short supply. The trials didn't vanish overnight, but they slowed to a crawl. Cases that once ended in execution began falling apart under the new rules. Juries hesitated, no longer sure whether a neighbour's story of ghostly shapes could justify death. Some accused were released outright. Others lingered in jail until petitions from family and ministers gained traction. The same officials who had signed death warrants now signed pardons. For the first time in a year, prisoners started leaving their cells alive. They returned home to farms stripped bare and communities that didn't know how to look them in the eye. Doubt was contagious in its own way. People who had testified began wondering if their dreams had been dreams after all. The afflicted girls, once the stars of the courtroom, lost their stage. Their fits no longer carried the same power when judges refused to see spirits hovering above the accused. Those dramatic collapses that once drew gasps from the gallery now earned only awkward silence. The crowds stopped cheering. Fear didn't vanish, but it lost its applause. With no one left to believe them, the girls faded into the background of everyday life, like actors dismissed from a play that had run too long. The colony's leaders tried to clean the mess quietly, but some stains refused to fade. The ministers who had once thundered divine vengeance now struggled to explain themselves. Among them was Samuel Sewall, one of the judges who had condemned the accused. His doubt didn't come suddenly. It crept in slowly every time he passed the hanging field or heard a neighbour whisper another name in regret. In 1697 he stood before his church congregation and publicly admitted guilt for his role in the trials, accepting the blame and shame. He asked God and the community for forgiveness, and the congregation answered with silence thick enough to measure. It was the kind of moment that said more than any sermon could. Sewall's confession didn't erase the hangings, but it showed something shifting. This same society that built the pyre now wanted absolution. From that point, the records read differently. Depositions that once built cases began reversing them. Confessions were reconsidered. Some prisoners were set free by direct order. A few cases were retried, only to collapse under the weight of reason finally waking up. The number of executions stopped at 19. No more ropes, no more gallows. The frenzy that had once united Salem in shared certainty gave way to an exhausted decency. Even the newspapers that had celebrated the judge's zeal grew cautious, referring to past mistakes without naming names. It wasn't pride holding them back. It was shame disguised as quiet. For ordinary people, the shift was almost too sudden to trust. A neighbour who'd cheered an execution in June might lament it by November. Mothers who'd lost daughters to the noose found ministers at their doors now offering sympathy instead of scripture about witchcraft. Some took it as healing, others heard hypocrisy. The skies over Salem hadn't changed, but the words had. Sermons that once condemned works of darkness began to focus on mercy, forgiveness, and community. Those themes sounded new only because people hadn't dared say them aloud for a year. The guilt lay everywhere, scattered like ash. The colony itself began to move on the only way a community can after shared madness, by pretending normal again until it sticks. Fields were replanted, though many stood half-tended because their owners were buried or jailed too long to harvest. Roads that had been deserted filled again with carts. Children played cautiously at the edges of the meeting house, their parents reminding them not to speak of witches. The topic became taboo almost overnight. Everyone wanted the nightmare to end, but no one wanted to talk about why it had happened. So they buried it quietly under work and prayer, as if silence could become repentance. Governor Phipps's policies helped solidify that silence. He ordered the remaining prisoners discharged and barred new arrest for witchcraft without concrete evidence. For a time, it was enough. The official stance became disbelief, not because people suddenly embraced reason, but because belief had become unbearable. Too much blood had been spilled in its name. The same Bible verses that once validated suspicion now sounded like mockery when read over empty chairs. Salem's people reverted to their routines, still faithful, still cautious, but with edges softened by weariness rather than conviction. Over the next years, more cases were dismissed or formally overturned. Slowly, petitions reached the magistrates asking for compensation to families of the condemned. It wasn't generosity, it was damage control. Yet even in that bureaucratic repentance, there was something human, a small attempt to balance the scales that had tipped so brutally. The court's tone shifted from righteous to apologetic, and that language set the pattern for future generations who'd try to understand what went wrong. In the simplest sense, mass hysteria cracked under its own weight. Exhaustion did what logic never could. When everyone had lost something, faith, family or sleep, the system had to stop eating itself. The doubts that entered the courtroom didn't come as rebellion. They arrived as fatigue. Ministers stopped thundering. Judges stopped believing their own authority was divine. Ordinary people stopped needing enemies to feel safe. The frenzy had burned its fuel, leaving only smoke. By the end, Salem wasn't triumphant or cleansed. It was hollow. The colony had proven it could destroy itself with conviction, and now it was learning the slow, humiliating art of reconstruction. Samuel Sewell's open guilt spoke for more than one man. It became the model for reconciliation the community desperately needed but barely understood. He prayed. Others watched. Some joined him in silence. And from that collective discomfort, a fragile understanding began to grow. If belief could damn them, maybe conscience could save them. In the quiet that followed, Salem's survivors were left with the hardest question of all: how to keep living in a world they themselves had taught to fear. You have to wonder what a place does after it kills its own neighbours in the name of righteousness. Salem didn't move on, it limped. The executions ended, but the memory stayed, like a wound that refused to close. By 1702, 10 years later, the colony officially admitted that the trials had been a tragedy. That word, tragedy, didn't erase anything, but it was the first time an institution that once praised the hangings admitted shame. It was also the first attempt at a collective confession, the start of 100 different efforts to make the record right. You can almost see the townspeople still crossing paths at church, the uneasy silence when old names came up, the shared guilt that aging didn't soften. No one could undo the ropes or the fear, but the government could at least rewrite the paper that justified them. Over the next decades, exoneration became a long bureaucratic prayer. It wasn't quick or heroic. It was slow, awkward, and patchwork. Families who'd lost relatives to execution petitioned for decades. They wanted more than money. They wanted their dead declared innocent. The General Court finally voted to annul some convictions, starting with a handful of names in the early 1700s. It was justice done one file at a time, signatures replacing the hangman's knot. But not everyone was cleared right away. Politics and memory, as it turns out, keep their own grudges. Some families were told their petitions lacked proof. Others waited for years before someone in power cared enough to open the ledger again. Money came next, though it was never really about money. The government approved compensation for the families of the condemned. Small sums measured in shillings and pounds, meant to signal repentance more than repair. A few refused the payment outright. They said no coin could erase a name carved into a headstone by fear. Others accepted quietly, their signatures trembling as they wrote them. You can picture the scene: a clerk at a wooden desk, a grieving relative filling quills with ink, both pretending this was justice. In truth, it was more like triage. The colony couldn't change what it had done, but it could document its remorse in ledgers and proclamations. Public repentance took human form in 1706 when Ann Putnam Jr., once the girl whose accusations had carried the most weight, stood in front of the Salem congregation and confessed. 14 years had passed since the hangings, and she was 27 by then, her voice steadier but still young. She told the church she'd been misled by Satan. that she had wronged many innocent people. She asked for forgiveness not only from the living but from the families of the dead. The silence that followed must have been heavy enough to bend the floorboards. Her apology didn't clear the record, but it cracked the wall of denial that had guarded Salem's conscience for years. She never escaped the shadow of what she'd done. When she died in 1716 at just 37, her gravestone carried no mention of the trials, as if forgetting was the only forgiveness she could find. Anne's confession did more than humanize guilt. It marked the moment when theology gave way to doubt. The colony had changed. Science was slowly replacing superstition as the measure of truth. Ministers still warned of evil, but more of them began to say that human error, not the devil, had guided 1692. Courts began insisting on tangible evidence and sworn testimony. By the mid-17th century, Massachusetts law had quietly built safeguards against the very kind of spectral logic that destroyed Salem. When new accusations of witchcraft surfaced elsewhere, they died fast, laughed out of court. The lesson had finally sunk in. Unseen crimes make for spectacular sermons but terrible verdicts. Still, undoing Salem wasn't just a legal problem, it was personal. Families connected to the accusers carried unspoken guilt for generations. They didn't advertise their ties. Many changed names or moved away. The ones connected to the victims held onto records, hoping someday the government would say what everyone already knew. The shame wasn't broadcast. It was inherited, passed down like a ghost story told in low voices. The town itself avoided the subject. By the 1800s, when most Americans wanted romantic tales of brave settlers and pure faith, no one wanted to remember that their ancestors had butchered neighbors over invisible crimes. But time does what confessions can't. Centuries later, the silence cracked again. Memorials began to appear, first quiet plaques, then stone monuments. The past had stopped being a curse and started becoming a lesson. Massachusetts revisited the official record multiple times, each new government adding the names of those exonerated until every last victim was formally cleared. The process stretched beyond living memory. In 2022, more than 300 years after the hangings, Elizabeth Johnson Jr., the last unpardoned victim, was finally exonerated. A schoolteacher and her students pushed for her name to be cleared. They researched, petitioned, and succeeded. The state signed off, ending the final piece of unfinished business from 1692. The notice was short, printed on official letterhead, but the quiet message beneath it was enormous. No matter how late, justice still mattered. That final act of correction summed up everything the colony had learned the hard way. Law now demanded evidence, confession required transparency, and justice meant more than obedience to fear. The undoing of Salem wasn't dramatic. It was generational. It revealed how slowly institutions learn humility. Each apology, each name cleared, showed that governments, like people, can someday regret what they once cheered. The lessons buried under the gallows had grown into legal principles: the presumption of innocence, the rules of evidence, the right to defense. Salem's ghosts, in that sense, wrote half the modern courtroom's code. Even with the apologies written and the statues standing, the old unease still lingers in the town itself. Walk through modern Salem and you see businesses leaning into the witch legend, tourists buying trinkets in shops that stand where people once huddled in prayer. It's cheerful on the surface but haunted beneath. The families who trace their lines back to accusers often keep quiet about it. The connections never truly go away. For every monument that honours the dead, There are unmarked hearts trying to forgive what their ancestors believed was holy duty. Some wounds refuse even the comfort of history. The inhabitants who came after had to find a way to coexist with the memory. So they built it into education, into plaques, into conversation. School children study the trials not as a story of witches, but of fear weaponized by authority. Scholars point to them as the reason American law demands due process. Modern Salem calls itself the Witch City, but the irony is sharp. Its fame comes from what its ancestors most regretted. You could almost say that the city made peace with its ghosts by hiring them as tour guides. If there's a lesson in these centuries of apologies, it's that true atonement doesn't arrive with fanfare. It arrives in layers. A governor's decree, a girl's confession, a quiet piece of paper 300 years later. Salem's redemption wasn't a single act, but a lineage of repentance stretching over 3 centuries. Its story reminds you that justice can be slow, but it must outlast fear. The hangings are gone, the hysteria has burned out, but the echoes still insist on being heard. The next chapter of Salem wouldn't chase witches, it would remember them. 300 years later, the word Salem still sends a jolt through American memory. You hear it, and even if you've never opened a history book, you know what it means. Panic, accusation, guilt. There's something about that year, 1692, that keeps echoing. Maybe it's because the trials weren't just about witches. They were about how quickly people can lose themselves when fear feels righteous. The interesting part is how recognizable it all still is. The methods have changed, but the rhythm stays the same. A rumor becomes certainty, certainty becomes outrage, and outrage demands a sacrifice. You've seen that sequence before, on screens, in headlines, and sometimes in your own conversations. Salem just happened to write the template before social media existed. Modern people like to believe they've outgrown superstition, but the logic of Salem survives because it isn't about demons. It's about how communities collapse under the weight of anxiety. Historians have traced the panic back to social fractures and old family conflicts. Others have explored psychological explanations, saying the trials exposed how ordinary humans behave when fear meets faith. Salem's people were devout, educated by the standards of their time, and still they built gallows over gossip. That's the uncomfortable part. It wasn't ignorance, it was conviction. The belief that truth could be revealed by emotion rather than evidence. You still see that impulse today, whether it's mass outrage over an accusation or the sudden exile of someone who said the wrong thing. It's easy to think the devil no longer shows up in stories, but the need for an enemy hasn't gone anywhere. The legacy of those trials stitched itself deep into the country's legal systems. Lawmakers later added safeguards precisely to make sure spectral evidence could never return under another name. The demand for proof, the right to face your accuser, and the rejection of coerced confession, each principle grew from the ashes of Salem. Even the phrase, innocent until proven guilty, gained weight as a direct reaction to what happened there. Fear had overwhelmed reasoning once. No one wanted the law to bless panic again. So the colony's shame evolved into one of the earliest American lessons about due process. Courts learned that belief isn't evidence, and conscience isn't law. You can trace that influence straight through American history, tucked into tiny footnotes of legislation and courtroom reform. The witch trials became a warning disguised as tradition, a reminder that morality, left unchecked, becomes tyranny dressed as virtue. It's strange when you think about it. The same Puritan colony that once hanged people for invisible crimes accidentally helped shape the language of justice. Every time someone demands proof instead of passion in a courtroom, they're pushing back against 1692's logic. Culture did the same work but with a longer memory. Writers couldn't leave Salem alone. The trials reappeared in essays, plays, and sermons from every century after. They turned into a national metaphor that refused to die. Each generation reached back to those gallows and saw something that fit their moment. During the Cold War, Arthur Miller's The Crucible used Salem as a mirror to McCarthyism. Politicians then were hunting communists instead of witches, but the rhythm was identical. Accusation as proof, loyalty test disguised as virtue. Audiences recognized it instantly because the story wasn't about the 1690s or the 1950s. It was about fear performing logic in public. Later generations kept reinventing it again and again. The Civil Rights era found in Salem a parable about majority morality turned violent. Artists in the 1970s used it to talk about conformity, warning that even modern towns punish difference when it becomes inconvenient. Today, the reference shows up online, tossed around in arguments about cancel culture. People use the phrase witch hunt casually now, sometimes carelessly. But the reason it works as shorthand is because everyone still understands what it means deep down, collective certainty drowning individual truth. The tools are new, but the mindset is antique. Public accusation, mob agreement, punishment delivered through shame. Salem might have used pews and parchment. We use screens and comments. Historians studying the trials emphasize how fear always finds structure in uncertainty. Salem was struggling with famine, border wars, political instability, and constant sermons about sin. Under that pressure, suspicion looked like community defense. Modern societies face different crises: economic collapse, ideological division, endless information, and the reaction looks eerily similar. When logic fails, we reach for stories that make sense emotionally. Then we act like those stories are evidence. That's how Salem's script keeps running. A story replaces proof, fear finds witnesses, and reason arrives too late. The tragedy fascinates scholars because it sits at the point where belief becomes weaponized. Each generation rewrites the events to match its anxieties, turning the same few faces, Betty, Abigail, Tituba, into symbols for whatever America fears most at the time. During wartime, they represent internal enemies. During social reform, they stand for injustice. In modern entertainment, Salem becomes a stand-in for female autonomy, power or persecution depending on the angle. The subject bends easily because the core question never changes. How far will people go to feel righteous? Every book, film, and lecture about the trials ends up circling back to the same discovery: that the horror wasn't supernatural. It was ordinary. The danger lay not in spells, but in the human craving for purity. When communities decide that safety means eliminating doubt, disbelief becomes treason. That's the contagion Salem exposed. It's why historians keep returning to it, and why the story still catches attention centuries later. Fear may look different now, hashtags and headlines instead of devils and spectres, but it still travels at the same speed, so you keep hearing echoes of it everywhere. In politics, where accusation replaces debate. In workplaces, where loyalty signals matter more than truth. In public conversations, where outrage works faster than understanding. The script repeats because it works. Salem is the country's original case study in groupthink, the moment when collective paranoia becomes policy. And that's what makes the story timeless. It isn't about the 17th century, it's about right now. Even science joined the reinterpretation game. Theories cropped up over the centuries trying to explain the episode rationally. Food poisoning, psychological contagion, social stress. One theory of convulsive ergotism suggested the villagers might have eaten diseased rye grain that caused hallucinations. Others favoured social explanations instead, pointing out the hierarchy, poverty, and old grudges that shaped every accusation. What unifies all those studies is the acceptance that the trials weren't random madness. They were the predictable outcome of pressure, division, and belief colliding in small-town life. Once fear became the shared language, the rest wrote itself. That's why the Salem story clings to American culture so tightly. It doesn't survive because of witches. It survives because it describes how belief behaves under duress. You recognize yourself in it even when you don't want to. The townspeople of Salem weren't monsters. They were certain. Certainty is always seductive because it promises relief from confusion. Once a community learns to equate certainty with virtue, truth becomes optional. Every audience that revisits the trials sees that reflection eventually. The reminder that progress in science or politics doesn't automatically grant wisdom. So when people reference Salem today, they're not just quoting history, they're confessing how fragile reason can be. The story endures as a mirror, not a myth. Fear never really disappears. It changes shape to fit the century. It finds new tools, new accusations, new rituals for belonging. Salem's shadow stretches across every generation that forgets how thin the line between belief and judgment can be. The trials left no witches to burn, only questions about the kind of people we become when being right matters more than being just, and how easily, with the best of intentions, we all end up lighting the match. Fear has always been the easiest story humans tell themselves. In Salem, it wore the clothes of faith, and belief became a weapon sharper than reason. The lesson isn't buried in the gallows, it's in the quiet mistakes that built them. Communities can choose empathy instead of panic, and truth that asks questions instead of demanding certainty. History reminds you that conviction alone never made anyone right. The same emotions that once fueled superstition still shape judgment today. So, as the echoes of 1692 fade, what remains is the choice, to meet fear with understanding before it decides who to hang next. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I do hope you enjoyed this brief stroll through history. Be sure to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy what I do here. I bid you farewell and wish you a pleasant trip on your way to dreamland.